So the purpose of today's talk is to put the local belief in Northamptonshire witches and some of the things I'll detail from the witch trials into a wider context, because I think it's really important to say that beliefs about witchcraft that developed in Central Europe spread to even localities like Northampton in the course of the 16th and 17th century, with the ultimate result that people were put to death for crimes we believe could not have happened. Now, it's really, really important to say that we can trace a belief in witchcraft, or more broadly, people who are perceived to have extraordinary powers, right back to classical antiquity. And indeed, we can trace this belief across all continents at various times through history. But in terms of Western Europe, there's only one period when these individuals are considered to be actively trying to bring down Christendom and to attack everything the Christian church believed in, and indeed its followers too. So the period, the early modern period, which I sort of talk about as the late 15th to the 17th century periodization, is contested. It is a period when people were put to trial for the crime of witchcraft, believing they were actively working with the devil to bring down Christian society. And you'll see how this maps itself out during the period. And I think it's also really important to say straight away that had these people been accused of witchcraft even 100 years before, they would not, most of them would not have reached trial. Many would have just been dismissed as mere popular superstition, and certainly wouldn't have been put to death for this crime. So something changes in that late medieval period to make people fear what were perceived to be earlier relatively benign figures, sometimes put on trial, but often, more often than not, they were not. The second thing I'd like to say is that it's important not to dismiss the belief in witchcraft as something held by people who are less intelligent, less rational than ourselves. That would be to do, as E.P. Thompson says, that's a sort of condescension of posterity. It's really important to say that some of the most intelligent people of the day not only believed in demonic witchcraft, which is what this talk is about, but actually wrote about it. And there are thousands of treatises and pamphlets written by judges, by kings like James VI and I, by senior church theologians, all advocating and accepting unquestionably that witches were in league with the devil. And indeed, so much so, it was almost heresy to believe the opposite. And so this is the context. This is a third-year option I've taught for many years. And my argument to the third years is, if I can't make you feel this was rational, given the period we're looking at, then I've kind of failed you in the course of my module. So let me take you to some of the limited evidence we have for Northampton witches in the next slide, please. That caught you, Bob. Okay, so as I was saying, there is very little evidence in detail of the witches, the individuals that were prosecuted for witches in Northampton. Probably the most famous pamphlet is the one shown here, The Witches of Northamptonshire in 1612. There is a second pamphlet in 1705, which focuses on Eleanor Shaw and Mary Phillips, but we believe that's a spoof. Nonetheless, it shows a very good understanding of how trials came about, the sorts of things people were accused of, and the outcomes of those trials. We believe it's a spoof. We cannot trace those names in parish records, whereas we can trace the names of Agnes Brown, Joan Vaughan, Arthur Bill, Helen Jenkinson, and Mary Barber. So we have a slightly more fuller picture of those individuals. And one of the first things to draw out, I think, from this slide is that, and I'll go into this in greater detail later in the talk, is that the majority of those people accused of witchcraft were women. And there's reasons for that. And you can see here that we do have one man. England in particular had a very high rate of prosecuting women over men. Something like 90% of those accused in England were women, and 10% were men. So Arthur Bill's tipping the balance a little bit in this way. And one of the things that I'll come back to in a minute, or later in the talk, is that all of these people had a reputation, and that will be very important as we go through. Agnes Brown was considered to be born of no good, according to the pamphlet. Joan Vaughan, her daughter, was brought up under her mother's elbow and therefore clearly born to no good as well. And Mary Barber, another one, she was basically considered to be licentiousness of her and passionate, and I think we can all interpret what that means. And Arthur Bill was begotten of poor parents, both of whom were witches. So you had to earn the title of witchcraft over some time, and that's really important to say, because one of the most fascinating facts in terms of prosecution for witchcraft in England in this period is that around 50% of those accused of witchcraft never made it to trial. Now, I find that fascinating because given that we don't believe these people could have perpetrated, I'm assuming most of us believe these people could not have perpetrated the crimes they were accused of, then it comes to the question, what tipped the balance? What made some people deemed to be worthy of trial and others turned away, or indeed, in rare occasions, went to court and were found to be innocent in many respects. The odds narrowed against you if you went to court accused of this particular crime. Now, in order to talk about the histories and the fates of Agnes Brown, Joan Vaughan, Arthur Bill, Helen Jenkinson, and Mary Barber, all of whom were put to death for the crime of witchcraft, we actually have to go way back into late medieval European society, and Bob's anticipated my next slide. Oh no, my next slide. I've anticipated the slide on, so apologies for that. The other thing I should say, these are the sorts of things that the witches were accused of. I just talked to you about 50% of those individuals being found guilty and around 50% not going to trial. So if we could go on to the next slide, Bob, sorry. These are some of the deeds of witches, if you like. And all of these, I would stress, I can spell. I've taken these literally from the pamphlet because I absolutely love the original spelling. So please don't think I haven't done a spell check on my presentation before giving it to you. But these were the deeds attributed to the Northampton witches, and they are really very, very typical of accusations of witchcraft across Western Europe. So some of the things were inflicting, griping, and gnawing pain. Now, interestingly, once you get to understand what witches can be accused of, you can imagine almost that anyone could be accused of witchcraft and found guilty. It seems like it's almost a catch-all as I go through things, but that's not the case. Early modern Europeans were very aware of disease, very aware of natural illness, very aware of changes in the weather, and they talked about cancerous things. At various stages, they talked about things akin to what we'd call epilepsy. What made an illness attributable to witchcraft as it came on very suddenly and was very extreme in various ways. So it was something other than natural in their mind. So once you have a belief in witchcraft, and I'll talk about why we have it in a minute, it doesn't mean everything is attributed to witchcraft. That would be almost irrational. But they were very careful in what they deemed to be possibly as a result of witchcraft. And quite often they'd go through various alternative explanations before they arrived at an allegation of witchcraft. Inducing fits was another one. So in someone who was otherwise healthy could be stricken down in a fit, may not feel part of their body. We might identify that today as someone potentially having a stroke or something. But again, it was the suddenness of that particular illness that could make it attributable to witchcraft. Many of them in England, although this wasn't common in the west of Europe, and the illustration of Matthew Hopkins shows this, had familiars and imps, often in the shape of animals who could go away and do their evil biddings. All sorts of notions of black cats that we think about in popular culture today. I actually, as I give this talk, I quite often think that I could have been an early modern witch. I had all the various tools and perhaps sometimes the wrong temperament to mean that I could receive an allegation. And the other thing that they increasingly had in this period, but really not straight away, but later on, was a witch's mark. And again, I'll talk about that later in the rest of the presentation. Obviously, the more serious thing they could do was cause death to humans and animals, and that is represented in the Northamptonshire cases. And they could do more bizarre things, which I think is testimony, perhaps the pressure on women to be almost the domestic goddesses that we talk about today. And I'll take you to the bottom one. One of the allegations in one of the Northamptonshire trials was that someone had put their washing out, and clearly it was very clean. And when she went to collect it back in, it had been covered with pictures of toads, snakes, and other ugly creatures. I just love that. And then finally, one of the tests of witchcraft that I'm sure you've all heard about was the floating on water. And this was actually done in Northamptonshire with Arthur Bill. It's believed very much that floating on water, you know, if you drowned, you were innocent. If you floated, you were guilty. That's not strictly true. It was part of a corpus of evidence to try and establish whether or not you were a witch. Of course, if people did drown, well, they'd gone to a better place, so you could rationalize that in various ways. But if they did unnaturally float, it wasn't the punishment, it wasn't the deciding factor, it was part of a broader base of evidence included within this slide that could lead to an allegation and a successful prosecution for witchcraft. I think the important thing to say here is that these are all everyday things, but not always did everyday things lead to an allegation of witchcraft, and that again I'll come back to. The ultimate crime of all witches, though, was a crime against Christian society, and this is why we talk about it as demonic witchcraft. And having the power to do these sorts of things, basically witches had aligned themselves with the devil in a conspiracy to undermine the Christian world. So whatever their earthly misdeeds were, their greatest sin was the sin against God. And at this time, a deeply religious time, there was no greater sin than a sin against God. So for years and years, for centuries and centuries, where witchcraft had been tolerated to some degree, where it was believed that people could manipulate natural sources for good or harm, this turned into, by the late medieval period, part of the devil's plan to undermine Christianity. And I would like to move on to the next slide, please, to talk about that. So what we see in the early modern period is a move away from what we call maleficium, which you would understand as simply black magic in various ways, to diabolism, which is devil worship. And basically the crime that these people were put on trial for across Western Europe was diabolic witchcraft. They had effectively gained their powers by swearing their allegiance to the devil to overthrow the Christian world. This association was made first, of course, by the church, by theologians. This is pre the Reformation, so this is what we'd understand to be the Catholic Church, but during the Reformation, Protestants also took to the belief in diabolic witchcraft. And it's a massive change because a relatively, as I said earlier, benign crime, it might be that you've caused someone some harm in some way through potion, becomes linked to signing yourself to be a servant of the devil. And the image you have here, and I use a lot of images, represents this. Now, this is the Sabbath in many respects. The Sabbath wasn't an idea that captured in England except during the civil wars for very particular reasons, but it was a belief that was widely held in Europe, whereby witches, once they'd aligned themselves to the devil, flew out to these meetings using pitchforks on the back of animals and things like that to pay homage to the devil and undertake all sorts of abominable acts, basically. And you can see here, this is a typical image often recreated in the demonological texts of people flying in. I'm pointing, thinking you can see me point, but of course you can't see what I'm pointing at. Flying in on horses and goats, cavorting, particularly with demons. You may pick some of those out in the images. And in doing this, they are getting power, if you like, from the devil to go and wreak havoc within their communities. So why do we see a huge transformation emanating out of the church at this time, which means that witchcraft becomes simply the work of the Christian devil? Okay, can I have this next slide, please? The argument is that a lot of things went wrong in late medieval Europe. And before I go on to those, I do also want to say we have to remember we're talking about a very different Christian religion and an understanding of Christian religion than we are today. And I think that's important to say because the early modern mind very much felt the world had been created in one go by God, and its destiny, its history was planned out in various ways. And he may or may not let you know what that course of history was. So all events and practices were read. They had meaning in various ways. And the idea of humans was to interpret that meaning as you would expect. And the font of that knowledge was really, of course, the Old and the New Testaments. And I'll come back to that point in a minute. So when I try and talk to first years about the early modern world, I say it's a world that has been finished. It's a world that God has created and taken to its completion. And we are living a course, or early moderns were living a course that was pre-planned, that was destined, ordered by God, and would come to a natural point in various ways. And of course, at times, if they were familiar with the Bible or had the Bible read to them, they would know that there were times in history when human society was tested. And for various reasons, in the late medieval period, people began to think their world was more sinful than they'd anticipated, and that perhaps God had licensed the devil to have more agency in the earthly world than theologians had previously understood. And the reason why they thought this was because there was a lot of extraordinary circumstances coming together. In sort of 13, 16, 17, there were massive crop failures across Europe. Now, crop failures are not unusual in the early modern period, but they happened over a sustained period of time. Therefore, they were seen as rather extraordinary. Similarly, we had the 100 Years' War break out between France and England, devastating war in its own right. We also, for a time, had two popes, basically because there was a split within the Catholic Church, and therefore the spiritual leadership of Europe was somewhat compromised at this time. But perhaps the biggest thing of all was the Black Death. As you know, the Black Death hit Europe and spread quite literally like wildfire. I mean, the connotations with today, and one of the reasons why we're doing this on Zoom and COVID really comes to the fore. When COVID started to really spread, it took me back to the early modern world and how they would have interpreted that. But as you may well know, the Black Death wiped out 20 million people in Europe, roughly. And that was a population out of a population of 60 million. So 1/3 of people died. And this was an extraordinary event going on with a number of other things at this particular time, which made theologians and scholars go back and look at how should they interpret this. This was, in effect, almost seen as a message sent from God, and they came to the conclusion that their society was deeply sinful. But I want to give you this quote about how an individual experienced the Black Death to tell you how this linked to increasingly different theological interpretations, if you like, of the balance of good and evil within the world. They died by the hundreds, both day and night, and all were thrown in ditches and covered with earth. And as soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug. And I, Agnes Brown, buried my 5 children with my own hands, and so many died that all believed it was the end of the world. And this, with all the other circumstances going on, led many people to believe in a sort of eschatology, an interpretation of the Bible that the world was coming to an end. And the signs, the Black Death, the wars, the famines, were all a sign that God was very angry with the world and humankind and the way society was going. So can you push on to the next slide, please? And what we see, we're a long way from Northampton, but it's all absolutely relevant, and I'll tie it back to the Northamptonshire pamphlets in due course, was that there was a changing theological explanation for the role of the devil, with a heavy emphasis on the New Testament as opposed to the Old Testament in various ways. And I know you all know that the Old Testament was written before Christ, and the New Testament was written after the death of Jesus. So in many ways, it's not always, but sometimes has a slightly more apocryphal tone to it. But if we look at how Satan was represented in the Old Testament, I've put here, this is from Darren Aldrich's work, who focuses on ideas of the devil. He was really seen as a tempter of mankind. He was there just to test you, really, nothing more than that. And if you were resilient and strong in your belief, you could thwart the ambitions of the devil. He was there and he would trick you and he could do all sorts of things. He's seen as a rather jokey figure, but nonetheless someone there to test you. But at the end of the Old Testament and part of the New Testament, we see coming into influence ideas in Christianity, the Jewish Apocrypha, which is a series of books which present a rather more threatening image of the devil, a devil that perhaps can have more agency within earthly goings on and perhaps had more power potentially to co-opt people into his service. And then in the New Testament, we see that ever more presence, that stronger devil in the book of Revelation. And I want to give you a quote from St. Paul's epistle to the Ephesians, because this is a quote that's sometimes used in witchcraft treatises and learned books to emphasize why there was a reinterpretation of the role of people who could perform extraordinary things like magic in aligning them to the devil, and why that was such a serious thing to be involved in. So as it says here, put on all the armor which God provides, so you may be able to stand firm against the devices of the devil. For our fight is not against human foes, but against cosmic powers. The devil becomes something supernatural, not a mere tempter, I should say, but something much greater than that, against the authorities and potentates of this dark world, against the superhuman forces of evil in the heavens, variously. So the devil gets developed in this massively stronger figure. And alongside this, there's an increasing sense that his supernatural power as a formerly fallen angel, so he has lots of knowledge, can be used to influence earthly human affairs. Okay, I'll move on again, please, Bob. Once we see this reinterpretation of the role of the devil within the human world, as evidenced by the extraordinary events and series of bad events that had hit Europe at this time, we see something called the Science of Demonology. People start to write about how the devil operates, who he operates through, and what they can do, and also what you can do as human society to fight this evil supernatural foe. And probably the most famous of these books is the Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1486-87. And this is effectively a do-it-yourself guide. It's a book that's deeply inconsistent in terms of what it says, but it's a do-it-yourself guide to why you should believe in an enhanced power of the devil, why you should believe in witches, why they're linked to the devil, what they can do, and how you should get rid of them to cleanse your society of this pollutant. And we see absolutely thousands of these publications come to the fore across Europe in this period, all talking about the terrible things that can happen. You see that the one on, as you're looking at it on the right, 1693, the terrible things that can happen from this belief that starts in Central Europe and comes to your neighborhood in England at any particular time, your hamlet variously. So we go from a grand theory of demonic witchcraft to more local publications which tell you what you can do to exercise your society of these evil influences. So amazing books, and many people say the Malleus Maleficarum sold very, very widely, was translated very quickly. You're talking eventually of a period that it developed the printing press into many native languages across Europe. And we have this whole science of demonology, and just go back to my original, what I said at the beginning, this James VI one, considered one of the most learned kings in his period, wrote about this after a stay in Denmark to meet his wife, where he met some senior and very knowledgeable demonologists. Judges wrote about this, theologians wrote about this, doctors wrote about this. So we are not talking about a belief that comes up from ordinary people. We are talking at this stage about a belief and a theory that transcends down from the hierarchy in society, some of its most knowledgeable people at this time, and they are deeply convinced that they have worked out why these things are going on and what society should do to put things right. Okay, can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. And increasingly, they argue that the devil is licensed to co-opt simple people to work in his service. And these simple people will work to undermine Christian society and Christian values as we know it. A witch, and this comes out of the Northamptonshire pamphlet, a witch is one that worketh by the devil. And here we can see there's almost a mockery of Christian practice where the devil is baptizing souls into his service. And again, this is a regular image presented in witchcraft treatises of the period. And this quote comes from the Northamptonshire pamphlet. So this is just to show you, in a sense, how these wider European ideas that gather momentum spread very quickly across Europe and spread right down into the county in which I'm situated at the moment, giving you this talk. And I'm not very far actually from the people in Thrapston and Ringstead. There is none, I suppose, the pamphleteer says, more distasteful or detestable to his, God's purity, than this damnable and devilish sin of witchcraft, which has led to an external separation and an irreconcilable divorce betwixt the pure mercies of God and the tainted souls of such miserable people who have sold themselves to the devil's services. And that's what Arthur Brown and Helen Jenkinson and Joan Vaughan did. They were found guilty through things they'd done of having in effect sold themselves to the devil's service. Okay, we can move on again, please. And this devil's world, this is something that was less prevalent in England, was a world that was predicated on being the opposite to a godly world in many respects. And many of the treaties, particularly those written in Europe, went to great lengths to describe the devil's world and the danger of the devil's world. And I've just given you an excerpt of the kind of things they wrote about. And again, this is from a learned French intellectual, really, of this period. And as he says, just to quote you, they, the witches, make the sign of the cross with the left hand instead of the right. They say the mass upside down and often naked instead of clothed. Sometimes raised into the air, head down and feet up, instead of upright with feet on the ground. And in this position, they elevate a black host instead of a white, and sometimes triangular instead of round. They kiss the backside instead of the mouth. They make banquets with bread or wine in contempt of the sacramental species, and worship the devil instead of God. They give sermons that exhort men to take revenge, to slander, to be lecherous, to steal and murder, to corrupt and ruin others. In that way, we're creating a world, if we don't take action against the devil and his army, we will turn the world on its head in various respects and live in a deeply sinful, an image, I suspect, of hell on earth in that way. Now, this kind of extreme writing of witchcraft is not that typical to England. This is talking about the events of the Sabbath, which is the meeting when witches fly to meet the devil. This only really shows itself in some parts of England, and as I said, mostly during the civil wars in the 17th century. Can we have the next slide, please? And here we have the images, and you've seen the biggest one. These are witches flying to meet the devil, to swear their allegiance to him, and to undertake all sorts of heinous acts as a result. The bottom one with the black demon figure in the middle is reproduced in many English pamphlets. The others are European based. Well, today, if we were flying to a devil's meeting, and I hope we're not, people have said to me, why broomsticks, pitchforks? Well, these were the utensils people had to hand. Today it would be Dysons. We'd be all off on a very colourful flying implement if we believed in this going forward. There's nothing particular about those things. It is what people had to hand. It is where society was at that particular time. Sometimes they are pictured riding backwards on a horse or some sort of animal. And again, that is to illustrate that they're flying into an inverted world, a world that's turned upside down. This is something that early modern Europeans would have understood quite well, the symbolism and how to read that particular message. Okay, if we can move on again. And here we see people preparing. This is Hans Baldwin Green, the very elaborate illustration of the witches' Sabbath. In Europe, that was the real big thing. If you were shown to have attended the Sabbath, then quite literally you were ripe for burning. And you'll see in the top of that, the witch is on the animal, which looks a bit like a goat, flying backwards. And the other thing, interestingly, you may or may not be able to pick out is that these are different generations. And this is pertinent to Northamptonshire because, as I said to you, Arthur Brown was considered to have been born of witchy parents, and Joan Vaughan was under her mother's elbow, so to speak, who was also considered to be a witch. So once you were a witch, you could co-opt other people close to you into the service of the devil. Again, if we can pass on, please. So let me just show you how those ideas are interpreted right down into Northamptonshire. And although I've used the spoof, or we think the spoof case here, we think this is probably built on a reasonable knowledge of local witch trials for which we have minimal evidence. I will say that this became so commonplace in Northamptonshire, where we get records. It's often in diaries. The Isham's there's a diary there where one family member just said, went to the assizes today and someone was accused of witchcraft. It's just recorded like burglary, like theft or anything else. It becomes very mainstay in this period to have someone come up on a not infrequent, we weren't some of the harshest prosecutors of witchcraft, but on a fairly regular basis, so that it didn't, I mean, some of the early accounts of witchcraft trials, they give you a lot of detail because it's quite new, but yeah, by mid 16th century and so forth, they're just one-liners. There's nothing to note, particularly it's a crime that's accepted in that way. But just to show you how this translates from the Eleanor Shaw and Mary Phillips, that living in one house together, they contracted with the devil about a year ago to sell their souls to him upon condition he would enable them to do what mischief they desired against whom they pleased, either in body, goods, or children. Now, this raises another interesting point, because there had always been a belief that people could learn to harness natural resources to, in effect, perpetrate magic. And most of those were men, and you will, I'm sure, know that many kings and queens would be accompanied by magicians in courts or advisors in various ways. But they had learnt their skill over many, many years. The difference between this type of magic witchcraft was that these people gained this power very quickly, and so they gained it illicitly. And the other thing was that they were women who were not educated at this time. So how had they learned this? Well, they'd been given this by the devil directly. And just to say, because of the heinous nature of their crime of aligning with the devil, they could only have one punishment. Their punishment was to be hanged till they are almost dead, and then surrounded with faggots, pitch, and other combustible matter, which being set on fire, their bodies are to be consumed to ashes. Burning was a key way of getting rid of pollutants in this period. Okay, if we can move on again. Okay, so what I'm hoping is that you've got a sense of how and why an idea that the devil has greater agency within the early modern world comes to the fore as a way to explain, in many ways, extraordinary and extraordinarily bad events that go on within the world in an intellectual framework that believes that we have a God that's omnipresent and will give you signs and messages, as he did with the flood, in various ways, telling you where human society was. So once this idea becomes deeply entrenched, of course, the idea is you must rid society of your witches, of your sinners. To do anything else would mean that we would lead to a world that was exactly the opposite of the Christian society people believed in. So the Malleus was one of the first to talk about, well, who were the witches? It won't surprise you to know that they came to a very clear conclusion. The majority of, there was nothing in the definition of witchcraft that excluded men, but for various reasons as explained by the Malleus Maleficarum, it was much more likely that women could be won over to the devil's service than men. And the reasons here are taken from the Malleus to show you why. Women were by nature weaker than men in respect of fundamental intellectual and psychological qualities, hence more likely to commit sin. Now, one of the ways you persuade people of your argument in the early modern period is to use examples. And there's nothing stronger than biblical examples. So, of course, for some, Eve was the first sign that women could be linked to witchcraft. She, of course, was the one that took the apple. As a consequence of their fundamental intellectual, psychological weaknesses, they were the devil's first target. They were his easy win in many ways. But if that wasn't enough, women had other characteristics which made them more vulnerable to the devil. Their secondary vices included, and these are quotes, curiosity, pride, vanity, and vindictiveness. Now, as we know, we are looking at a world where views on women were significantly different. It was a patriarchal world in many ways, and intellectual arguments were built on precedent. So if I could have the next slide. And there were Christian thinkers who didn't always have the best view of women. And I just give you some examples. And it's the last one of these, it's the most important. So if you read Boethius, a 6th century Christian philosopher, of course, I've taken the extreme. In his Consolation of Philosophy, he's quite clear. Woman is a temple built upon a sewer. You can see a theme emerging here. St. Udo of Cluny, to embrace a woman is to embrace a sack of manure. But nothing was more damning than St. Thomas Aquinas, because he was one of the key thinkers and most influential people for the late medieval, early modern world. And what he said was, nothing deficient or defective should have been produced in the first establishment of things. So women ought not to have been produced then. So it looks like we were a bit of a mistake in the grand Christian world, variously. Okay, if we can have the next slide. And just to show you how that pans out, it has quite serious consequences in many ways. Estimates vary about the numbers of people put to death for the crime of witchcraft in the early modern period, and they estimate from around 50 to 100,000. There have been extreme estimates much higher than that, but most historians will say perhaps 50,000, maybe a bit more up to, but certainly no more than 100,000. But in terms of how that balances out, given that there was nothing gender specific in the definition of a witchcraft, they were merely a servant of the devil, and some of those early images I showed you showed men as well as women being baptized by the devil. Nonetheless, 75% of those accused were women and executed. 75% of those executed were women. But that varies enormously, and that's the figure for across Europe from country to country. In France, it was 50-50. In Germany and Scotland, you can see the figures here, 70% women, 30% men. In Hungary, Denmark, and England, 90% women and 10% men. So you can see the balance in England and Denmark and Hungary being very much stronger towards women. And in Iceland and Estonia, for a variety of reasons, which I can't go into today, they were mostly men. Suffice to say, in Iceland, in a funny sense, they believed that to be able to perpetrate magic, you had to be quite clever. So they didn't really see why that women had the intellectual faculties to do it. So it's one of those instances where having a negative view of women might work in their favor. It was more nuanced than that, but that's one of the things they thought. This might, and this has led some historians to argue that this is a gender war, that witchcraft is a gender war. It's a crime created by men, and it's a crime that's prosecuted by men, i.e. holding senior positions within the law courts, with the victims being the majority of women. So there are some historians who have argued that what we see in witchcraft is an attack on womanhood, if you like. There is absolutely no doubt in this period that women were seen as lesser than men in many ways. They were the weaker vessel, if you like. But my view, and I'm happy to take questions on this, is this crime of witchcraft was created through a genuine fear of what was going on in society. It wasn't created to attack women, but as they worked through the idea, increasingly they believed women were likely to be its perpetrators. What I've done now is set up the intellectual framework. Many of the allegations of witchcraft actually come from the bottom up. So while it's the elite that create this intellectual idea of demonic witchcraft and pass lots of laws so you can prosecute witchcraft, actually the allegations come from common people. And most of the allegations against women come from women. So if I can have the next slide, that'd be great. So this is really interesting, and this is borne out again with the Northamptonshire witches. Most accusations are made by ordinary women, not elite, against other women. Might have had a slightly separate status within their community, and I'll come back to that. Most popular beliefs on witchcraft, most of the allegations focused on maleficium, the effects of bad magic. They didn't really talk about the devil. The devil was the way in which the authorities could change the law to prosecute for witches. But the older ideas of witchcraft, the older maleficic ideas of witchcraft, are those that come forward in the accusations. And there are a lot of recurring themes in local accusations. And again, I'll pick on some of the work that's done and align that with Northamptonshire. Reputations were hugely important in allegations of witchcraft. It was very rare that someone accused of witchcraft in England hadn't perpetrated a reputation for being, let's just say, antisocial within their close-knit communities for some period of time. When you look at trial records, they will often recount instances 10 years ago. And what you're doing is building up a case against an individual as to why eventually they might be accused of witchcraft. So it takes time. And these people have often, for many, many years, for whatever reasons, aggravated their community members. And certainly this is the case if you read the trial records of Agnes Brown, often thought to be short of tongue, foul-mouthed in various ways, and difficult to work with. The same with Mary Barber and Arthur Brown. So allegations, even once you create this crime of witchcraft and reform the laws in England, it doesn't mean that people suddenly flood courts. That's not the case. What triggers, if someone has a reputation, an allegation of witchcraft, is a falling out. And often it can be quite an incidental thing. So if you look at Northamptonshire, Joan Vaughan, and I quote from the pamphlet, was as far from grace as heaven from hell, i.e. she developed a reputation for having not the most virtuous nature, fell out with a very unfortunately named Mistress Belcher, who was of slightly higher standing within the village. And they had an argument. And they had such an argument that touched the modesty of this gentlewoman, Mistress Belcher, that she was actually moved to hit Joan Vaughan. And she did. And then when she returned home, having hit Joan Vaughan, she became very quickly and terribly ill. As I put here, in intolerable pain. Again, I emphasize I'm using their spelling, not my own. And Mistress Belcher, having had a virtuous and godly reputation within a community, having wandered and having been healthy up to this point, eventually ruling out other things that could have happened to her, attributed her illness. Her brother went to the house of Joan Vaughan and backed off and came home and fell ill. So it was another extraordinary circumstance in the way. Eventually decided this was witchcraft. And the way the courts work is that once there's an allegation, you get the depositions, and then different members within the village will testify to the witchy nature of that individual. And then things can turn against you. And as I said, if you go to trial, you are very, very likely to be found guilty. So we are a mile away here from the theology of devil worship and so forth. But no doubt, many of these people in their local churches were preached to and warned about the crime of witchcraft and to look out for the crime of witchcraft. And they would often therefore attribute certain things. Animals suddenly dying. We know how important animal livestock was to families in this period, who lived much more meager lives than, of course, we do today. And if they couldn't see any other understanding of why an animal suddenly drops down dead, and there was some sort of ill feeling between themselves and another village member who had built up a reputation, then an allegation of witchcraft could occur. Okay, if you can move on to the next slide, please. And just to give you a sense, therefore, of how this character of the witch builds up, Agnes Brown led her life at Guilsborough in the county of Northampton, of poor parentage and poorer education, one that she was born to no good, was for want of grace, never in the way to receive any, ever noted to be of an ill nature and wicked disposition, spiteful and malicious. And many years, and it's this many years of having developed this character, before she died, both hated and feared among her neighbours, being long suspected in the town where she dwelt of that crime, meaning witchcraft, which afterwards, of course, as a result of the trial, proved true. And this is what we see. We see these characters. Someone said it's to me, it's like having almost at one talk, it's like an ASBO, you know, where people are always causing friction within their community. It's an early modern version without much more disastrous consequences, of course. If we could have the next slide, please. How do we explain this? And I'm coming to the end of the talk. You're glad, I'm sure, to know. Why did people believe in witchcraft at this time? Because it served a function. It served a function, the top end of society, who had to try and explain in a way why a Christian God, in many respects, was allowing quite seriously bad things to happen within the world and working with their intellectual framework, not anything that's comparable today. And they interpreted that as a sign. So it allowed the elites in society to explain the devastation of the Black Death. It's not the only thing they did, but to explain the ill circumstances and realize perhaps they'd underestimated the power of the devil, but he couldn't do it alone. On the other side, it allowed ordinary people to, if you like, transfer guilt for bad things that may have befallen them, which they may have looked on themselves in a rather negative way. Could they not have transferred that guilt? And this is particularly true in some countries. Lyndall Roper's work on Germany has looked at this around childbirth. Childbirth was very precarious at this time, but it was an important aspect of being a good wife and a mother. And quite often allegations of witchcraft are attributed to lying in maids and things like that when a child or baby, seemingly healthy, very suddenly dies. It's also a means of redress. It gives you agency and action to do something, to put a wrong right in various ways. And we think that provided a function both for the elites trying the cases, but also for ordinary people living often very, very hard lives, full of uncertainty in various ways. And of course, above all else, it consolidates community norms. It's conservative. Because if you truly believe in this crime of witchcraft and someone is acting in an antisocial, anti-communal manner in various ways, and you can take them to trial, of course, what you're sending out a message to say, this is the expectation of you at this time. This is the expectation of you as a good Christian in many ways. And should you demur from that, you will, of course, face the ultimate punishment. So if we could move on, thank you. So I'm really reiterating what I've just said. For the elites, it became a way to explain some evil and bad happenings within the Christian world with a benevolent God. For ordinary people, a means to explain local misfortune and take action. And so I'm going to leave you with a rather controversial statement from Robin Briggs. In that way, to understand what witchcraft meant, knowing, of course, the awful consequences it had for people in Northamptonshire and people across Europe, it was nonetheless seen as a form of therapy. People believed in it and they believed they took action for the good. It had disastrous results, but it wasn't necessarily always motivated by anything other than trying to put right a wrong. And that's where I'll leave it, if that's okay. I've no